The restaurant smelled like saffron and old promises. I'd rehearsed the words on the ride over, the diamond cool against my palm, my pulse a steady drum of certainty. Claire laughed the whole night, the kind of laugh that used to melt the edges off me. When I slid the box toward her and everything in my chest opened up, she looked at me like I'd asked for a favor, then turned to him, to Ethan, her childhood best friend, and let him close the distance instead. Ethan's grin was a practiced thing, sharpened by years of being the safety net everyone else clung to. Claire's eyes shone with something I'd never seen when it was me standing there. Excitement, relief, a terrible, traitorous gratitude. Her hand found his, not mine. There was no drama, no scene. She simply folded into there forever, leaving me with my box and the tasting menu gathering dust between us. I didn't shout. I didn't storm out. I paid the bill, thanked the maitre d' like a man who'd just been told a truth, and walked into a night that changed everything. That night I didn't decide to go quietly. I decided to learn how things fall apart. Claire's family looked like a portrait hung on too many walls, opulence bordering on rot, smiles lacquered over debts and favors. Mr. Hargreaves, Claire's father, ran his empire the way a puppeteer breathes, subtly, patiently, with a smile that never reached his eyes. Mrs. Hargreaves curated charity galas and private accounts. Ethan. He was everywhere. Dinner parties, boardroom lunches, the dependable boy everyone praised for standing by Claire. Once I started looking, the seams showed. Small things, construction permits unsigned, shell companies with familiar initials, a charity whose fundraising paid for nobody's health but everybody's lifestyle. I saw patterns and smelled the same stale money that stained everything on proposal night. Claire had been choosing comfort, not love. Ethan had been choosing advantage, not affection. I could have walked away. Instead, I kept watching. I took a job that put me where secrets gathered: law firms, financial journals, the kind of places where ink traced lines someone else wrote. People started to mention names around me. Documents breathed when I knew how to read them. I didn't want to break Claire. I wanted to expose the rot that made her nest so sweet. I mapped the Hargreaves world like a cartographer tracing a shoreline before a storm. I attended board dinners under the pretense of curiosity. I befriended an assistant who was tired enough to talk, and a contractor who loved telling stories when he'd had too much whiskey. Little by little, I gathered the ledger of their life. Off-the-books loans, favored vendors who were relatives on paper, a loan to a development that never existed. People lie easier when they believe their lies are insulated. The family's power came from people who were paid to look the other way, politicians with quiet smiles, regulators with softer pens. I collected names until the list read like a phone book of culpability. I learned that Ethan's loyalty was a transaction. He'd been positioned, groomed, and rewarded. Claire's laughter that night had been relief that a comfortable future had been secured, not romance. When I found the first real smoking gun, an email threading payments with charitable donations, I felt something like vindication and something colder, responsibility. I could whisper this to a reporter and watch the Hargreaves tremble, but whispers are fragile. They can be smothered. I needed something louder, something that could survive the varnish their lawyers would throw over everything. Ethan had a past that clattered when you opened the wrong drawer. He'd been involved in a development deal 5 years ago that collapsed and left a town with a half-built park and a lot of angry creditors. The Hargreaves quietly bought certainty for the creditors. Ethan quietly inherited a business position and a lifestyle. There were signatures that connected him to offshore entities, and an old associate named Marco who had disappeared after a particularly nasty audit. One night in a bar too crowded for privacy, Marco slid into the booth opposite me. He was thinner, the edges of his face sharper, like someone who'd been carved down by trouble. He didn't want money. He wanted to see a ledger inked in sunlight. He wanted closure. Marco handed me a flash drive and a map of names. He told me how Ethan had asked him to handle cleanup on a job that went sideways. Marco had refused to be the cleanup man. The cleanup had found him instead. His fear was a hollow bell. He'd been lucky to walk away. He'd been lucky until Ethan's face began to appear on invoices and plain manifests. With Marco's documents, the Hargreaves world stopped being rumor and became evidence. I felt the first small, satisfying heat of something growing, a plan that could not be scolded away at a dinner table. You don't start by burning the mansion down. You begin by dimming the lights in the rooms where power is made. I leaked a small piece, a seed of truth, to a journalist who had a taste for the kind of corruption that smelled of perfume and payrolls. The piece was careful, verifiable, unsettling, just enough to make the Hargreaves glance at each other across the table. The reaction was surgical. A hush among their allies, calls in the night, a wrinkle of anger in Ethan's jaw when he thought I wasn't looking. It was intoxicating to watch a family used to dictating the news scramble to patch a wound they called minor. But the wound was only the beginning. They lashed out, hired a PR firm with a fine press release and a prettier charity gala, and tried to suffocate the story with generosity. That night Claire posted a photo with Ethan at a foundation event, a filtered smile like a flag planted in a place of calm. I watched it go up and felt nothing but a professional satisfaction. This wasn't about her face in the photograph. This was about the tremor under it. I would not be the man who screamed. I would be the man they couldn't ignore. The gala was all crystal and veils, the sort of scene designed to make you forget what your neighbors endure. I attended as a donor, anonymity bought on a ledger of my own making, and watched them work the room. Mr. Hargreaves moved like a conductor, directing praise and applause to people who owed him favors. Ethan stood close to Claire, whispering something that made her nod. Midway through the evening, a video played on the big screen, not the charity highlight reel, but a piece I'd arranged through a whistleblower in their accounting firm. It showed invoices, signatures, money moving in a dance that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with laundering reputation into profit. The room went quiet. Glasses clinked once, a sound that in that moment seemed unbearably loud. The Hargreaves tried to recover with platitudes, but their faces betrayed them. Claire's hand trembled on Ethan's arm. For the first time I saw something like fear. Then, in a corner bright with flashbulbs, Ethan stepped forward and lied with the grace of a practiced actor, calling it a misunderstanding. The cameras ate him up. I left before they could force the night back into its gilded shape. Outside, the city smelled like rain and possibility. My plan was no longer theory. It had opened a door. They hit back harder than I expected. Legal threats multiplied like wasps. Anonymous donors withdrew support. A senator publicly praised the Hargreaves for their lifetime of service. Ethan began to stalk my life in small, venomous ways. Friends quietly blocked. My bank asked questions. A loan application flagged. It wasn't subtle. It was all their muscle flexing. But they had underestimated two things: how much I had already learned, and how easily the public's affection turns when prompted. I arranged for the next wave of revelations to drop in regulatory reports and internal memos that were impossible to spin away. I also learned something else. Claire, despite choosing Ethan, still had a conscience that blinked when confronted with facts. She called me one night, voice raw. "I thought he loved me," she said. It wasn't a plea, it was astonishment. I told her nothing. There was no satisfaction in soft explanations. There was only the raw business of making sure the Hargreaves paid for what they had built. The press stopped treating the Hargreaves as monoliths and started treating them like clients of a terrible firm. Boards began to distance themselves. The foundation's bank accounts were frozen while auditors looked for ghosts. Ethan's vidi didn't hold under scrutiny. His donors evaporated. His meetings emptied. Mr. Hargreaves tried the oldest playbook in the book: buy loyalty. He called in favors, arranged meetings, reminded people of past kindnesses. But with each call, another quiet voice in the corner recited the numbers I'd laid before the public eye. The children of board members texted their parents, "Is this how we want to be remembered?" The Hargreaves had bought influence, but they hadn't bought conviction. Claire watched the unraveling like a woman seeing a tapestry she'd admired for years finally pulled apart. She began to ask questions at dinner tables. Asking is dangerous when you live on money earned by silence. Her family's fury flickered at home. Arguments behind closed doors, brittle apologies, and a father who refused to look her in the eye. Then Ethan made a mistake you can never fully recover from. He believed his invulnerability. He invited me to a dinner, smug, patronizing, sure I would accept. I went, not because I wanted to be humble, but because you learn more over food than in closed offices. There, in a room lit too brightly for secrets, he spoke loudly about what had to be done, names, places, favors, and a plan to fix a loose end. His arrogance was his undoing. A young woman in catering recognized a name and later, moved by guilt, handed over a message she'd intercepted. That message, the sort that proves intent, was the hinge. I had it transcribed, time-stamped, secured. Ethan had detailed in casual tones the plan to silence a small problem. He thought he was untouchable. When I walked out of that dinner, I knew legal consequences would follow. But I also knew that reputations reinforced by violence cannot be reclaimed. The next morning, the record found a home where it couldn't be ignored. The prosecutors moved faster than gossip. Investigations opened, subpoenas were issued. I watched the Hargreaves empire narrow into a single courtroom sketch. Ethan's face, once smoothed for small talk, sat under harsh lights while his history was read aloud. Claire came to the hearing, not to gawk but to listen. There was a confusion in her eyes I couldn't untangle, sorrow, anger, and something that might have been self-loathing. I did not revel in their pain. I'd spent so long making sure every piece of evidence was clean, every chain of custody unquestioned, that the legal world could do its work without my fingerprints smeared across it. I was careful because there's a difference between justice and revenge that leaves you as broken as the people you meant to punish. The courts did what courts do, slice through rhetoric and leave the law. There were convictions, settlements, ruinous fines, and apologies measured in press releases. In the end, the Hargreaves were legally broken. Ethan faced charges that would take years to resolve. The foundation dissolved under the weight of its own exposed rot. Justice can be loud, but consequences whisper later. The Hargreaves' house was empty of laughter. Their name was a cautionary tale at the very galas they once hosted. Claire moved out of the family home. She found a small apartment and, without fanfare, began volunteer work at a clinic I'd helped fund anonymously. She wanted to do something that couldn't be bought or spun. Ethan was isolated. His friends evaporated under scandal's sunny glare. Mr. Hargreaves' health, always a downstream victim of stress, declined. The family fortune thinned into a life spent repairing lawsuits and paying reputations into being again. It was never the same. I could have checked the box and walked away then. I could have taken comfort in the symmetry of my life restored. But when you build something out of pain, satisfaction is a shy animal. I found instead a distrust for the kind of power that made people believe they were above consequence. One evening I got a message. Coffee. She arrived with no makeup, a borrowed sweater, and eyes that had learned to be wary. She asked about the leaks, the dinners, the documents. She asked if I had wanted to hurt her. My answer was honest. I wanted the truth to be seen. She cried then, not for the family she'd been given, but for the part of herself that had been traded for convenience. We talked until the cafe closed. She told me about the pressure of being the good daughter, of smiling while men decided the course of lives. She told me how Ethan had been a cushion and a chain, how she'd mistaken comfort for choice. She apologized for the night of the ring, for the way she'd fallen. I didn't press for forgiveness. I accepted the apology because sometimes people deserve an honest closure rather than a trophy. She stood to leave and hesitated. "Will you stay out of my life?" she asked. It was a question about more than my presence. It was a plea for autonomy. I told her I would, provided she took her life and ran it on her own terms. She nodded, a small fierce thing, and left. Victory, it turns out, costs more than the enemy does. My name had carried a shadow. I'd disrupted lives, toppled a dynasty, and the public loved me and loathed me in equal measure. There were people who called me a hero, and people who whispered that I'd been reckless. Some friends kept their distance. Opportunities shifted. I became someone whose resume opened doors but whose presence could complicate a boardroom. I slept poorly for months. Sometimes in the dark I saw Claire's face and wondered if I'd stolen her agency when I took the story public. Sometimes I saw Ethan, gaunt and furious, and worried that my choices had turned his desperation into something uncontrollable. The law had done its work, but the aftermath belonged to us all. I started teaching workshops on corporate ethics, whistleblower protections, how to read a ledger that tried to hide a body. It was my way of being constructive, turn the skill that had been used for vengeance into a tool for prevention. It wasn't redemption, it was a scaffolding. Years later, the Hargreaves name had faded from headlines. Claire sent a letter, handwritten, thanking me for the life she could begin to own. She wrote of small victories, a patient in the clinic who got better, a neighbor who finally received aid, a day when she laughed without guilt. The letter sat on my desk like a soft proof that people could rebuild. Ethan tried to rebuild too, but the court of public opinion is not as kind as the law. He worked small jobs now, his charm no longer a currency. Sometimes I'd see him in neighborhoods we both frequented, a silhouette more human than monstrous. He'd look away like a man who remembers what he lost. In quiet moments, I revisited the night of the ring in my head and felt its sting. Not for the lost romance, but because it had been the first honest moment of my life. That honesty had cost a family their empire and me a kind of innocence. It was worth it, I told myself, because some things are only corrected by the force of light. I don't pretend I'm a noble man. I am a man who learned how to read the maps others draw for themselves. The Hargreaves were not monsters in the cartoon sense. They were people who let ambition erode empathy. Claire reclaimed a life that had almost been bought for her. Ethan paid a price that reflected his choices. The city remembered the scandal and moved on, as cities do. I moved on too, but the memory stayed like a scar that reminds you where you've been. Sometimes I meet Claire for coffee, and our conversations are brief and honest. We are older now, not by much, but enough to have the edges softened by time. We are not lovers. We are two people who collided with each other's stories and survived. When I walk past that restaurant where the ring lived for a night, I sometimes imagine different endings, quieter, kinder ones. I think about how fragile trust is and how fierce it must be to protect it. In the end, I did what I thought justice required. The fallout was messy, and some people didn't survive the social consequences. But perhaps surviving isn't only about staying unhurt. Sometimes it's about learning to be better after you're hurt.